So, you know, this room is patterned on the original Virginia House of Burgess.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yep.
It does kind of look like a
It's
courtroom.
very nice.
Please.
Courtroom. Yeah, we're guilty as charged.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be back with you all. Good morning. Great pleasure to be back with you all. We had a terrific event at the end of last week with Mike O'Hanlon, and not to say that this is part B of that conversation, but I think this will complement, perhaps contrast, and give a terrific overview of the state of the world with one of America's most important statespersons over the last 5 decades. We are just thrilled to have John Negroponte as the Schlesinger Chair at the Miller Center. John and I have known each other over a number of years through a number of different connections, but in one of my recent meetings with him, he reminded me that he started his service in the Eisenhower administration. When you get a taste of the breadth, depth, but also vigor with which John not only views the world but has engaged with it, you will shake your head in how he's been able to do this for that long a time. John has served directly under presidents going back to Richard Nixon, where he was on the National Security Council staff, working all the way up through and including in the George Bush administration and in the handoff to President Obama. As you may know, the Schlesinger Chair is designated in the name of and was funded by James Schlesinger, who served as Secretary of Defense under President Nixon and then later as Secretary of Energy under President Carter. John knew James Schlesinger in those various things, so it is really extraordinary that we get to have him serve as our Schlesinger Chair here. He's been, as I think you know, Ambassador to the United Nations, Director of National Intelligence, Deputy Secretary of State, Ambassador to Iraq, Ambassador to Mexico, Ambassador to Honduras, and Ambassador to the Philippines. And I'm sure I've left out a half dozen other important jobs that he's held. Deputy National Security Advisor, started, among other things, in the Foreign Service, but as a Foreign Service officer on the ground in Vietnam, where he reminded me he first met Richard Holbrooke. So the extent of John's service and the depth of not only his knowledge, but also his context is really without parallel in American politics today. And we'll even have a chance to talk about his relationship with George H.W. Bush, who he's known across those various parts of service. We are also thrilled to have conducting our conversation with John today, Stephen Mull, who is the Vice Provost for Global Affairs here at the Miller Center. Stephen is just a great part of our community, and we are really lucky to have him both at the university and working closely with us at the Miller Center. If you don't know what the Vice Provost for Global Affairs does, I'll give you a quick sketch because you will be seeing him soon. First of all, he is succeeding somebody who is really important to the Miller Center, Jeff LeGros, who many of you know. Jeff was a faculty fellow. More importantly, he co-chaired the search committee that hired me, so I have a particular debt of gratitude to Jeff LeGros. He was a friend of mine for the decade before that. I probably shouldn't say that after the fact, but I was introduced to Jeff by people that I knew working in the White House who said he is just one of Charlottesville and UVA's treasures, and I certainly found that to be the case. And I see Claire Gargali in the room mentioning that Jeff is a graduate of the university, or the college that Claire went to, Middlebury College, where my wife also went. And we could not have done better in Jeff's successor in Steve Mull. Steve will now oversee leading UVA's global relationships and strategic partnerships around the world that include China, India, Spain, the UK, and probably a dozen other places that I haven't mentioned that he will mention soon, as well as coordinating all the global activities of the various schools and departments of the university. And as I sit down and talk with him, I realize the depth and breadth of that engagement. He comes to us after a career like John in the Foreign Service, where he served as ambassador in Poland and in Lithuania. But his service is broader and deeper than that. He was the principal negotiator for the Iran nuclear agreement. Implementer of the Iran nuclear agreement, working with the State Department team on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. His last job was as the acting undersecretary for political affairs. For those who have worked in the State Department, I think we probably have a few alums of that prestigious organization. This is the most important career job in the State Department. Every once in a while, a career official rises to the level of deputy secretary, but the job immediately below that among the undersecretaries, the first among equal, is the undersecretary for political affairs. And Steve was acting undersecretary for political affairs from spring of this year until midsummer when he started here. We are thrilled to have him, and I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Steve. Thank you, Steve.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bill, and thanks to you and all the friends at the Miller Center for giving me this incredible opportunity that one doesn't very often get, which is to grill one's former boss in public. So I promise to behave. It was such a great honor serving under Ambassador Negroponte for several years, and I will actually first turn the floor over to him for some opening comments, and then we'll start the conversation.
Well, good. Thanks, Bill, for the invitation, and thanks, Steve, for grilling me. I thank you in advance. Forgive you for whatever indiscretion you may commit. I must say I chuckled to myself when Bill said that one of Steve's responsibilities was going to be to help coordinate what the various parts of the university are doing internationally. It reminds me of when I retired from the State Department the first time, and I was put in charge of the international activities of the McGraw-Hill companies at the corporate level. I was the executive vice president, and all I want to say to you is good luck with that. Because I remember the fiefdoms of Standard & Poor's, Business Week, and they kind of wondered who this whippersnapper was who had just retired from the State Department. Matrix management, it's very difficult, but challenging nonetheless, and I know it's important to have a central person who's really well aware of everything that's going on internationally in any organization. So it sounds to me like it makes sense for UVA as well. Because this long previously scheduled talk happens now to coincide with this period of mourning for George Herbert Walker Bush, I thought perhaps I'd concentrate my opening remarks on that aspect, and then we can talk about current foreign relations and the Trump foreign policy and so forth. But and since I knew Mr. Bush quite well, I knew him for a curious combination of reasons, one of which was that he had a younger brother. I think his actual name was John, his christened name, but he went by the name of Bucky, and I remember him as Bucky Bush, and we were classmates at Yale. So I got to know him pretty well, and I even was invited to his wedding in Greenwich, Connecticut in 1959. We all remember that the Bush, while he may have prospered politically in Texas, the roots were in New England. I then happened to, and Bill referred to it, I was the director for Vietnam on the National Security Council from, let's see, in the period 1971 to 73, and we signed the Vietnam Peace Accord in January of 1973, just as George Herbert Walker Bush was becoming chair of the Republican National Committee, and Dr. Kissinger asked me to brief him on the content of the agreement. So that was kind of my first substantive exposure to Mr. Bush. I had bumped into him that's later, in '79, when my wife and I were traveling to New England, and we bumped into him in Boston Airport, and we asked him and Barbara what they were doing there, and he said, "I'm going to Maine to announce my candidacy for the presidency of the United States." And I said to myself, in fact, I actually uttered the words, "Oh boy," just because I didn't know whether he knew what he was in for. He obviously did, and turned out to be an extremely persistent and tenacious political figure beneath that veneer of gentleness and gentlemanliness, which he was also. I had a lot of exposure to George Herbert Walker Bush when he was vice president, because at the beginning of that administration, for almost the first 4 years, I was ambassador to Honduras. And as you remember, we had a few things going on in Central America at the time. And so the vice president used to be one of my fairly frequent visitors. He came down there several times. I even took him once to visit the president of Honduras at his home village outside of the capital of Tegucigalpa, and he took a strong interest in what we were doing in Central America, and I got to know him even better at that time. And a couple of times he was coming back from one of, you remember the joke about, what he always would make about how I'm the guy who goes to the funerals. Well, he did. He'd get twice when he visited me in Honduras. He was just coming back from having gone to the funeral ceremony of one of the Russian leaders. You remember they died in fairly quick succession there at one point before Mr. Gorbachev came to office. When I was the deputy national security advisor under Colin Powell, I had a more intense exposure to George Bush. He was then vice president. We briefed President Reagan every day. We gave him his national security briefing from 9 to 9:30, very civilized hour. The Bush family tended to start earlier in the day, but Mr. Reagan came in at 9 o'clock sharp. You could set your watch by when he left at 5 o'clock every afternoon too. So 9 to 5 men. But the vice president was there most of the time. I was there from the end of '87 to until the administration left office in January of '89. And so I saw him quite often. He was an attentive member of those briefings, and of course knew there's not much you could teach George Bush about foreign or national security policy at that particular point in time. We tended to see him less as the campaign wore on. He'd show in, make a few appearances towards the end, but obviously in the second half of 1988, he was preoccupied with getting elected. And I did have some encounters with him and with Jim Baker about some of the issues that concerned him at the time. And one of the ones was the way we were dealing with Manuel Noriega of Panama, because it was kind of interesting. We'd have meetings about Noriega. Some of you may recall we indicted him under a racketeering act of some kind, but we had no real way of enforcing that indictment or forcing him to appear before a United States court. And the government was really quite divided about what to do about Mr. Noriega. Mr. Schultz felt that we should send in the Marines. This is actually fairly typical. Secretary of State wants to use force, and Mr. Carlucci, the Secretary of Defense, and Admiral Crowe, Chairman of the JCS, thought we hadn't yet exhausted our diplomatic options. So, and I'm not kidding you, that's fairly typical. State Department's a little bit quicker sometimes to recommend the use of force, maybe because they're not quite as versed in the awesome responsibilities and complications that can involve. So Mr. Reagan was there like that, like watching a ping pong match between the two, and Reagan was not good at making decisions when his senior advisors were divided. And so finally Schultz said, well, you want negotiations? I'll give you negotiations. And so he appointed somebody to, for the next 6 months or so, meet with Manuel Noriega and his acolytes. This would be in the first half of 1988, to see if we could find some arrangement whereby he'd step down from power, but we'd try to negotiate some immunity from prosecution for him, and so on and so forth. And George Bush and Jim Baker were kind of seething about this, and they really, it made them extremely uncomfortable, because they felt as they went into this political campaign that they risked being accused of negotiating with narcotics traffickers. And Jim Baker called me in a nice, friendly manner over to the Treasury Department one day, and Bob Zellick was there, and he told me, John, we got to stop these negotiations. We don't want to be accused of negotiating with a narcotics trafficker. And finally, Mr. Bush's preference prevailed, and we suspended these negotiations and waited through the election campaign. And as you then will recall, not long after Mr. Bush had assumed power, we actually did invade Panama, and we enforced that indictment finally. We were able to haul him before a U.S. court and convict him of what he had been indicted for. But that was kind of a little vignette about sort of one of the few times I saw some daylight between Ronald Reagan and George Bush. When he was president-elect, he asked me to stay in the White House, but for his term, and or for at least for the beginning of it, and I told him, boss, I'm really a Foreign Service officer. I'd love to go abroad. And so he said, well, just let me and let Jimmy Baker and Colin Powell know what you want. And so I gave Colin Powell 3 choices, and Powell looked at me and said, John, don't give him list of 3 countries. Tell him what country you want to go to. And so I said, okay, Mexico. And eventually, early in the next year, I was nominated for Mexico. I have some, I guess I would have loved to stay and work with him, but I found Mexico equally satisfying. And as it turned out, we launched the North American Free Trade Agreement talks during that time, thanks to the recommendation of Secretary Baker and the endorsement of President Bush. And it was fascinating to watch the way he made decisions. Baker and I went in with just one other person, an NSC staffer, in about February of 1990, maybe March. And I told the president, look, I've been asked by President Salinas of Mexico to sound you out as to whether you'd be willing to enter into free trade discussions. Salinas really wanted them because the Berlin Wall had fallen. Eastern European countries were all competing more effectively for global savings and global capital, and he felt he had to do something to make Mexico more competitive. He had just come back from the World Economic Forum when he had this idea that we got to get a free trade agreement. And Baker and I briefed the president for an hour, and the president just listened to us for about 55 of those minutes and then just said, okay. That's the kind of guy he was. He listened carefully, and then he'd make his decision. He didn't have any difficulty doing that. And then he was terribly supportive, even though, of course, there was the Gulf War and all sorts of issues about ending the Cold War that preoccupied him for the remainder of his term, and which we've heard so much about in the last couple of days, and which he and Secretary Baker handled so skillfully. But I never felt, even though he had very little time for the subject of NAFTA or Mexico, I never doubted for a moment that we had his full-fledged support. And he actually came down to visit Mexico right before we liberated Kuwait. He came down in November of 1990, and the invasion of Kuwait was sort of early in the following year. And you could see from his face, from his exhaustion and everything else, that their minds were totally preoccupied with what was going on in Kuwait and in the Middle East. But they found time for this very important issue. And I think one of the reasons they did, and in that I think George Bush was very similar to Ronald Reagan, they believed in having good relations with your neighbors. It was pretty basic, but it was really true. They wanted good relations with Canada and Mexico, frankly, not unlike Franklin Roosevelt, if you think about it, and the good neighbor policy of a number of years earlier than that. So I guess in sum, I'd say I thought he was an incredibly decent man. Jim Baker said the other day that he's about the only guy he can think of who became president by being and being such a nice guy. But yeah, nice, but I'd say tough. I don't think there was, just because you're nice doesn't mean you don't have the kind of fortitude that I think Bush showed in so many different ways, including, of course, initially his valorous service as a naval pilot. I'd say the second thing about him was that he was totally prepared for the job. If you've been vice president for 8 years and had the kind of experience running the CIA and been ambassador to the UN, I think he used the phrase a couple of times during the '88 campaign, no training needed. It's absolutely true. Oh, by the way, I meant to comment on one thing that Bill said when he introduced me. You said I was the DNI and I was ambassador to the UN, and I would have added, and therein ends any similarity that there may exist between John Negroponte and George Herbert Walker Bush's career. but we had two similar jobs. He was low-key, but he was very sensitive to the thoughts and feelings of other people. And he also believed that in the conduct of his relationships with other countries. He told me once when he was president-elect and I was the deputy NSC advisor, and we were having a series of meetings with Latin leaders who'd paraded in to see him. There was Carlos Andrés Perez, there was Oscar Arias, there was Pepe Ascona from Honduras. And he pulled me aside before we went into one of those meetings. He said, you know, John, to be honest with you, there's not much we can do for these countries. There really isn't. But at least we can meet them, we can show interest and show that we're trying to understand their thoughts and concerns. And so that's what I'm trying to do now in this period before I take the oath of office. And he did likewise with Carlos Salinas, the president-elect, who was also president-elect of Mexico. And they met in Houston, I think before either of them, sometime during the month of November that year, 1980, when neither was president yet, but they had a meeting before that, which I think really set the tone for the bilateral relationship with Mexico during that time. They used to call it the spirit of Houston when they talked about the relationship. And I guess that's the last point I'd make by way of introduction, which is that, or initial comments, that is that for George Bush, I think a lot of foreign policy and a lot of his life was about relationships. He cultivated them, he nurtured them, and I'm not saying in some kind of superficial or just a guy who cares about his Rolodex. No, somebody who really cared about other people, and he reflected that not only in his personal life, but in his conduct of relations with other countries. So anyway, that's for starters.
Well, thanks for that really touching recollection on the legacy of President Bush. Thinking back in 1992, in that election when he lost, I don't think many people really fully appreciated it. Obviously they didn't. They were much more focused on the economy, his reputed lack of attention to that. But today, I think, looking back, I think all of us can really appreciate what an extraordinary legacy on foreign policy he left to each of his successors in terms of leading a really pretty chaotic world at the end of the 80s and early 90s in an extraordinary equilibrium and balance that really positioned the United States extraordinarily well to manage conflict going forward. And since that time, a lot of people say that both Republican and Democratic successors abused that freedom of maneuver that they inherited from him and soon began to overreach, whether it was NATO enlargement during the Clinton administration, the growing diffusion of NATO's strategic purpose, which very quickly got in the way of developing any kind of constructive relationship with Russia, moving into the Bush administration with the invasion of Iraq.
Of course, yeah.
And
I was there for that too.
Absolutely. And so moving beyond, and so many people say that overreach through one administration after another inevitably produced the backlash that resulted in President Trump's election and fractured what had been a fairly consistent domestic consensus since the Second World War about the need for America to have a leading role in the world. So I wonder, as we are at the halfway point of the Trump administration, is that equilibrium that President Bush left us, is it gone forever? Is there some way to recapture that going forward? And for bonus points, how would we recapture that?
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful question. There was a lot packed in to your question, Steve. And I guess I'd start with whether maybe that room for maneuver, not so much as being abused, maybe in some respects was squandered. Mm-hmm. And sometimes maybe we didn't fully appreciate how much room for maneuver we had. And secondly, probably how hard we would actually have to work in order to maintain it. Mm-hmm. And that it wasn't a free good and it wasn't going to last forever if you didn't earn it or do whatever it takes to maintain it. And of course, your comments about how we handle the relationship with Russia, it relates back a bit to the Gulf War that we were talking about earlier, because I sometimes wonder whether Mr. Bush might have handled the Russia transition just slightly differently if he'd had more time to reflect upon it, but he was preoccupied with the Gulf War at exactly the same time as the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Berlin Wall falling. So under the circumstances, I think they did pretty damn well, given the cards that they were playing, but maybe there was more that could have been done to help keep Russia on side and to help it transition better to whatever was awaiting it than what we actually did. And I think people kind of lost interest in helping them.
You know, it's an interesting point, because I remember—
Were you involved in some of
Well,
that?
in those days, I had, it was a terrific job. I was what was known as the senior watch officer in the operations center. And I was in charge of a shift in the State Department's crisis management center. And my very first day of work was the day Iraq invaded Kuwait.
August 2nd.
Yes, and I wanted to run from the room screaming. I thought I was going to be a total failure. It was totally overwhelming.
You didn't cause it.
I didn't cause it, but about an hour after I showed up and the invasion was happening, the phone call came from Secretary Baker and said, get me Edward Shevardnadze on the phone and make a record of our conversation. We need to get to work. And they turned to me, said, get on the phone and be the note taker. And it was this extraordinary experience. And then to, in fact, from that very first conversation, look at the extraordinary job. You know, I suppose you can always do things better, but how James Baker and then later President Bush managed that relationship with a battered and bruised Russia with respect, looking for ways that they could make a positive contribution to managing the crisis.
So, and because George Bush had been ambassador to the United Nations, and because he firmly believed that we shouldn't retaliate or go back go into Kuwait unless we had both congressional approval, explicit, and the legitimating imprimatur of a UN Security Council resolution, they worked very hard to obtain those two things, and they obtained them. And Jim Baker went around and visited the capitals of practically every member of the UN Security Council in order to get the requisite vote. And as Colin Powell pointed out yesterday, we had even a Syrian and an Egyptian division
that's right.
Involved in that particular war. So yeah, no, they managed most things. I'd say, I don't think you can point to a more effective foreign policy team in the last 50 years. No. I really don't. No. Now, is that gone forever? I think you were asking. And what about now? Well, first of all, obviously, Mr. Trump does not, from a foreign policy or international relations or national security point of view, does not compare especially favorably with George Herbert Walker Bush. But once we get past the question of how we might feel personally about Mr. Trump, you know, where are we at the moment and where might we go? It's obviously a huge question. I would say, is it gone forever? No. Has the system, the international system, as we knew it after World War II, been dismantled? No. It's a little bit like a fire or a flood going through your house. And it really boils down to the question of how much damage has really been done, and what does the insurance, the appraiser say when he comes in? Oh yeah, we can fix this. Or, I'm sorry, it's a total loss. Well, I don't think it's a total loss, and I think it can be fixed. I think that the longer you take to fix it, the more ill will that might be generated and can cause you to have adverse future consequences. But let me point to a couple of maybe bad instances and good ones. I mean, the two that perhaps bother me the most in terms of what they've done is, one, to withdraw from the Paris climate agreement, not because I think every jog and tittle of the Paris Accord is correct, but having been myself in charge of the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science under Ronald Reagan, when we negotiated the Montreal Protocol to protect the stratospheric ozone layer, I mean, I think this stuff's important. And I also believe the science. I mean, we had the science advisor of Ronald Reagan didn't believe the science. But you know, we managed to maneuver around him to get Reagan to, and nor did Don Hodel. You may remember the famous Don Hodel, the Secretary of Interior, when they asked him, well, what are you going to do about these if you don't do a treaty? He said, well, people should buy more sunblock. That was his, I'm not kidding. And Herblock, you may remember him, had a famous cartoon about all of that. Everybody walking around with umbrellas because we didn't have an ozone treaty. So, I mean, I think it's good, it would be good to maintain the momentum of work, international work on climate change issues. And if you repudiate the Paris Agreement, you're sending exactly the opposite signal. And that's, therein, it seems to me, lies the mistake on that one. And the other one that bothers me quite a bit is the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the economic area, the trade agreement between the 12 countries, including ourselves and Japan, a lot of Southeast Asian countries, and I think Australia and New Zealand. I mean, he did that on his first day in office. In fact, he withdrew from both of those, I think, his first day in office. And, you know, that just sort of was an invitation to China, first of all. It left us devoid of any meaningful sort of non-security related strategy towards East Asia Pacific region. We have a security strategy, but not our whole, it left us without an economic strategy. And much about Asia is about economics, after all, since it's the sort of demographic and economic, becoming the demographic and economic epicenter of the world. So those, I think, were two serious mistakes. Other mistakes he did not make. You remember he was going to throw the NAFTA overboard until Mr. Perdue came, his Secretary of Agriculture came running into him and said, boss, you know, every state in the Union has Mexico as its first or second largest importer of American agricultural products. And so finally that seems to have been salvaged after about a year and a half of talks. And we'll see what happens in the relationship with China, which of course is our most important bilateral relationship. And they had this kind of, this meeting, long-awaited meeting in Buenos Aires a couple of days ago, where I guess there was sort of a truce where Mr. Trump didn't impose additional duties on Chinese imports in exchange for an agreement to pursue some of these structural economic issues that we have problems with. And the Chinese apparently have also promised to increase some American imports, particularly again of agricultural products, because they had suspended the import of American soybeans. And you know, they're in a command economy. They can turn these things on and off much more easily than we can do. So we have to see where that can go. But I guess you'd have to say, even if you want to put things in as positive a light as you can, I guess I'd say, gee whiz, the education of this president is taking an awfully long time.
You know, I think one of the hardest challenges for any president conducting a foreign policy is managing strategically important relationships that, by their very nature, are messy and unpredictable, and often present decision makers with just a series of bad choices that are hard to overcome. And I've been reflecting a lot over the past couple of months on how President Bush approached the relationship with China. You were just mentioning China. After the Tiananmen massacre and democracy uprising and the suppression of that by the communist authorities, which put anyone who's the American president in a very difficult position because of America's long historic support for democratization and liberal values, up against the risks of antagonizing a really important strategic partner for the United States. And he had to walk an extremely delicate line. Got a lot of criticism from both sides at the time, but again, in retrospect, I think he handled it as well as anyone could have expected. So fast forward to now, we have a very challenging strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. And President Trump approached the aftermath of the Khashoggi murder in a different kind of way. He decided to really basically not try to walk a line, but one could say, but really foursquare settle on the side of Mohammed bin Salman in the interest.
On the side of his perception of our interest in the relationship.
Exactly.
If you want to state it objectively.
Yeah, indeed. So how...
or more objectively.
Yeah. I mean, are there situations in foreign policy where you're faced with conflicts like that, where in fact it makes better sense to pick a side and then defend it to the hilt, or is it better to try and walk that narrow line?
Well, I mean, what a fabulous question, and what a it's worthy of treatises and term papers and PhD theses and everything else. And I think some of it comes down to just personal style. Chris Hill, our colleague, who was ambassador in various places, I said once at a forum like this, Mr. Trump's comments could use a little bit of fine-tuning. That was kind of a nice understatement. So he's got this kind of street smart New Yorker way of talking about things. I mean, sometimes I think I'm listening to a New York police chief than I'm listening to a president of the United States. He's not very nuanced in the way he talks about issues. And so I heard him and Mr. Pompeo speaking very starkly about this definition of what our interests are in Saudi Arabia. And look, we've got question of the oil, and we got questions of these arms sales, and I'm not going to put those at jeopardy because I come down hard on them on the human rights question. You could argue that he's saying what the other presidents have thought, but just chose to handle it in a little more nuanced way. And I would add, they're actually starting to take some measures to show disapproval vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia's prosecution of the war in Yemen, and by taking away, saying we're not going to provide air support anymore, and so on and so forth. I mean, to me, and the training I have and the work I did all my life, I would come down on the side of these nuanced approaches. You can send messages to countries, and they'll take them aboard. I mean, what did Mr. Bush do? He sent Brent Scowcroft and Larry Eagleburger to Beijing, and I believe they went secretly at first, to talk to the Chinese. And we did put the relationship somewhat in the deep freeze for I can't remember exactly how long, but it became harder for high-ranking U.S. officials to visit China and so forth. But at the same time, he recognized and knew, first of all, he had friends there, but secondly, he knew what we all know today, even more so, that the bilateral relationship with China was going to be the most important bilateral relationship that the United States has. And so it behooved us to think a little bit about the long-term consequences of however we choose to react. You know, we could have just shown them how mad we were and stopped their imports or done something drastic, but who knows what the long-term consequences of that kind of reaction might have been. I think Saudi Arabia is in a slightly different situation. First of all, I don't think it rises, no matter what you say, to the level of importance that represented by the bilateral relationship with China. I seem to remember when I joined the NSC with Dr. Kissinger in 1970, I had a colleague next door, Chester Crocker, whom you know, who was at Georgetown, writing a paper on how we were going to use Iran as our cat's paw in the Middle East once the British had withdrawn from the east of Suez. He was doing that at the instruction of Dr. Kissinger. You remember Iran was very much in fashion back in the early 1980s, which is
it is now too in a different way.
Well, but it's the other side of that coin, is it not? Right. There we are. So neither of them are as important as they. Especially now, what's happened with our own domestic oil production.
One of the things I think that you and I would probably share in terms of positively evaluating the Bush administration was, from your experience working actually at the National Security Council, and more recently my work in the State Department as Executive Secretary, was how the foreign policy process worked under President Bush and General Scowcroft, where Scowcroft did an amazing behind-the-scenes job of surfacing options for the president to make the final decision. And as you pointed out, he then made those decisions quickly and well. Fast forward to today, I remember from my own recent experience, my last few months of my career working in the State Department, it was actually quite extraordinary how the interagency process that had flourished, I think, under the Bush administration and since then had become in a way almost obsolete or somewhat withered. So for example, in preparing for President Trump's summit meeting with President Putin in Helsinki, or the NATO summit that happened last summer, there was not a single principals committee meeting or a deputies committee meeting to prepare for that. And instead, the policy development process is run in such a way that it seems to be based more on the president's instincts, the national security advisors' policy objectives, who, in forming those, I think has a fairly good relationship with the secretaries involved, but there's not really a broader process that had been there before. And then more broadly, just the question of reaching out for expertise. Aaron David Miller tells this terrific story about how when he was an analyst on Lebanon in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research in the 1980s, he had written a memo analyzing the situation in Lebanon. And about a week later, he got a phone call from the Vice President's office. The Vice President got on the phone and said, "I'm so sorry to bother you, Mr. Miller. I know you're very busy, but I've just read this very interesting memo that you wrote, and I've been left with a number of questions. Do you have 10 or 15 minutes? May I ask you the questions? And Aaron said, yes, of course. And when he got off the phone, it was, what an extraordinary privilege to work for a policymaker who knows what he doesn't know, and isn't shy about reaching out to get
who
the expertise.
appreciates the wealth of knowledge and experience that exists within that government of ours.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Many different agencies.
Yeah. So a lot of professionals, I think, regret that doesn't really happen so much anymore, that there's not that much reliance on expertise. It does seem to be.
It'll happen again.
I hope.
I'm the appraiser now. I'm appraising the damage inside the house. I'll tell you, I honestly believe that'll happen again. And some of it may even come back during this administration. I think that Mr. Pompeo has maybe instilled a certain amount of order in the department and a little more optimism amongst the personnel of the Department of State after his predecessor kind of fumbled around, really. That's, I think, the... I think you're right about using the NSC system. I'm sure this administration does it less and in a less systematic way than it may have been done at the past. But let me just make the alternative argument as well for a moment, which is that sometimes the people who, run the system value the system above all else. And I've seen times when I felt the NSC just got so enamored of its processes that it ended up having too damn many meetings. They would sometimes call us to meetings 2 or 3 times a day, and we were busy officials handling this and that. You had a foreign visitor, you had whatever, and then they say, what do you mean you can't come? And so then they get annoyed with us when lower level officials went and attended their damn meetings. So, I mean, I was deputy NSC advisor. I ran that process, right? I ran the deputies committee, and I've counted the number of meetings I had, and they were considerably less than have occurred subsequently. And remember, presidents have the constitutional right to run foreign policy pretty much any way they damn well please. Franklin Roosevelt didn't use any particular machinery. He had a coterie of advisors that were right in the White House with him, a couple of admirals and what was his name who died really shortly after he left the White House, and I can't remember the civilian who's, I've forgotten his name, but we didn't have that system. John F. Kennedy he inherited an NSC. In fact, Eisenhower was probably one of the most organized of them all. He had an operations coordinating board, and he had all kinds of stuff. But the Bay of Pigs was decided sort of on the back of an envelope. So I think it can vary enormously from president to president. I think as a general rule, since we established effectively a national security state, you could call it that in some respects, since 1947 with the National Security Act and creation of a CIA and the creation of the NSC advisors position, I think it's reasonable to expect a more rather than less organized method of reaching our decisions, since the resources are available and it enables you to best tap into all these different capabilities that are all around town. So I think that's more desirable, though not absolutely essential. I think perhaps an even more essential element is that the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State get along. Because those are the 3 key national security advisors underneath the president. And I've seen it both when it worked and when it didn't work. I remember when Caspar Weinberger and George Shultz were not on speaking terms. It was terrible. And then Weinberger resigned because his wife was very ill, so Frank Carlucci went over to be Secretary of Defense. Colin Powell got promoted up to be the National Security Advisor, and that's when I went over to be his deputy, and George Shultz was there at State. And Colin instituted, here's this young lieutenant general, instituted a very simple mechanism. He had a 7 a.m. meeting every workday of the week for 10 minutes with George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger. They came to his office and the three of them met to talk about the order of the day. And believe me, that swept away a lot of possible misunderstandings and glitches about, who was doing what to whom. And I think George Herbert Walker Bush had a very good team in that regard. And actually, you got to say that, well, I don't know about John Bolton, but certainly Jim Mattis and Mike Pompeo get along extremely well. And I don't know, I just don't have personal knowledge of how they relate to John Bolton.
I wonder if I could ask you to, before we take some questions from the audience, ask you to prognosticate a little bit. One of the big, Donald Trump has prided himself on being a disruptor. And one of the biggest disruptions, I think, has been in his approach to the Middle East peace process. Again, going back to the Bush administration, where really the United States, for the first time in a very significant way, expended a lot of effort to bring the Palestinians at the table, develop a good working relationship with the Palestinians. The Madrid conference resulted in a big success for Israel, getting rid of the resolution of Zionism equating racism, the establishment of a number of Muslim countries' diplomatic relations with Israel. But then that launched a process leading to the Oslo Accords, and then really through the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations had an approach to the Middle East peace process that was an incredibly frustrating issue.
Well, Clinton came close.
He came close, but didn't succeed. Bush said, enough, figure it out on your own, more or less, but then also inevitably started getting pulled back in. But more or less, since George H.W. Bush left office, we've tried to keep relations open to all sides in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, trying to manage, tweak here and there to move the peace process forward. That seems to have demonstrably changed in this administration, where we've made a number of unilateral moves, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, significantly cutting back assistance for Palestinian causes in the United Nations and in our own assistance budget. And it seems clear that we've decided we're really going to double down on putting as much pressure as we can onto the Palestinians. So are the Palestinians weak enough, in fact, to ultimately cave and make this a worthwhile gamble? Or do you think inevitably we'll get back to trying to balance among all of the sides?
I don't know, but that's the honest truth. But I think that I do know a couple of things. One is that ever since 1948, every time there was conflict of some kind, the amount of space available to the Arabs in the former Palestine got reduced, right? I mean, if they just settled, instead of starting this insane war in 1948, just settled for what was on offer at that particular time, they would have 10 times as much territory that they have any chance of achieving, even if there is a settlement. So that'd be my first observation. And each time they attacked again, seemed to be part of their DNA at the time, they lost more territory, right? So that's one part of the story. Number two, and these are maybe not in the right order, but just I don't think that the Arab-Israeli peace process looms as large an issue on the foreign policy landscape as it did a number of years. It's not the defining issue of the Middle East. I don't think. Some people might argue it is, but it seems to me that they moved on to a few other issues, not the least of which is Iraq, of course, which we've certainly played a role in that, and then, of course, Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the just the nature of the issues has changed somewhat, and that, I think, probably, if I had to guess, diminishes the chance of some kind of peaceful settlement. And then one thing that hasn't changed vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict is that the U.S., if you had said we've doubled down in our support for Israel, I think that statement would also have been true, right?
Absolutely, right.
And that's remained a cornerstone of our approach to that area. And in fact, we've done it even more emphatically with, like you mentioned, moving the embassy to Jerusalem and the close relationship between parts of the president's family and the government of Israel and so on and so forth. So I just don't see that. No, I don't see a solution. No. I really don't.
Well, on that hopeful note, why don't we open it to the audience? Maybe we'll get ideas from the audience here. Is there anybody who would like to pose a question? I think we have a microphone in the back.
Yes, there's one over here.
Well, my question was back on NAFTA.
Yeah.
You know, I heard a lot that with NAFTA, it wasn't so much the treaty talked about the movement of goods as much as the movement of capital, and that's why we lost so many jobs. So I'm wondering, was that the intent, and how did we see that benefiting the U.S.?
Well, it was basically an agreement governing trade in goods and services back and forth between the two countries. I don't know if it explicitly really was so much directed at the issue of capital, other than it encouraged the Mexicans in the direction of opening up their financial system to more foreign investment. You know, I don't think they have any restrictions anymore on foreign ownership of banks. But I've always felt that the main thing that the NAFTA accomplished in the trade area was to accentuate what was already there, which is North America has a competitive advantage if it uses Mexico to manufacture some of the inputs into these products that we ultimately make, and like automobiles. And that some people who think that the choice is between having American investment in automobile factories in Mexico or not having it, and then it'll all come back to the United States, are not really thinking it through, because I think what would happen ultimately would be that those opportunities would pass to other countries, Japan or Western Europe, and they wouldn't necessarily automatically come back to the United States. I can think of a number of instances where by moving some of the lower end manufacturing to Mexico, we saved jobs in the United States because of the complementarity between. You'll find companies that sometimes will put some of the very sophisticated high-end work, they'll keep it in the United States, but they'll move some of the lower-end stuff into Mexico. So I think the unhappiness with NAFTA came as much from just the fact that new technologies have had basically a tremendous effect on the nature of work and on manufacturing jobs in general, and the fact that you can have a plant with only a handful of employees crank out a bunch of automobiles today, as opposed to, you know, however many hundreds were involved before. It gets conflated with the issue of losing them to another country, and it's probably, you know, some of both. Now, this new arrangement that they've negotiated was to determine that 72%, I think, or 72.5% of the content of any automobile exported or bought under NAFTA rules has to be in the three countries, and also X number of X portion has to be with laborers that are paid over $16 an hour. So I think there's been some effort to mitigate the tilt towards Mexico, and I think it's going to help somewhat. But I'm glad we saved the overall agreement. I think it would have been unfortunate for all these different supply chains that we have within North America if we'd just sort of thrown the thing over the side.
They're in the back.
I had a question concerning the U.S., perhaps in Western, relationship with Russia. And I guess since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's been kind of a running debate going on over the years up to now on the responsibility for that relationship and its developments. Much of it centering on Russian attitudes and conduct, the product of actions we've taken on policy and other steps. The NATO enlargement has often been a part of that, but it's certainly not the only issue. But I just wonder if you have any reflections on what we might have done that might have been better in guiding or cultivating the relationship with Russia, or how much of that situation, that relationship, is a product of Russian disposition and ideas and ambitions that we really can't change too much.
Yeah, I like the way you put the question, and I think I generally come out on the second part of your comment. I mean, they're responsible for the way they've behaved, and well, look at what Mr. Putin said. He said that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And of course, when he became prime minister in this kind of, sort of he became the unlikely prime minister of Russia back in the late 90s. They were suffering terribly from the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The economy was like the size of the Netherlands or something like that. Oil prices weren't that high. They had privatized the oil industry, so they didn't get that many revenues into the government. Then he comes into office, I think determines to restore Russia to some kind of glory and prestige globally. And he worked to, first of all, husband the resources produced by the Russian economy. He nationalized back, right? He renationalized some of the oil sector to be able to get more resources for the use of the state. Oil prices went up, oil production went up in Russia, so they became somewhat better off. And then he started to flex his muscles in the so-called near abroad. So, whether it was Georgia or Ukraine or wherever, and we're seeing a continuation of that now with what they did in 2014 by annexing the Crimea. So I think there's probably limits to what we could have done to curtail or moderate that kind of behavior, but there probably are things we could have done at the margin. And again, getting back to various nuances that we could do that maybe would have made them feel less defensive in their approach to the world. I mean, this isn't too different, is it, than some of the thoughts that Lenin had about the world and encirclement and so forth, and concern about that, which was one of the reasons they had the Soviet Union in the first place, right? But I think there were times when I think we could have been more inclusive of the Russians. They've been applying, their application to join the OECD is about 20 years old, I think. There must have been some moment in that relationship during these past 20 years where we might have been able to see our way to letting them join. We keep the Chinese out too, which is the second largest economy in the world, but we'll see what happens with that. And as I said earlier, maybe there's some things we could have done more to assist them during their period of transition than we did. That effort, I think, kind of fizzled. But you got to ask yourself, it's just like after World War II, when we, I think, initially said we would make the Marshall Plan available to the Russians, and they're the ones who rejected it. They didn't want it because I guess it gave us, would have given us too close a look at what was going on inside. I'm not sure I know. I mean, maybe they're more comfortable to some extent with a decoupled world. I don't know. Could that be one of the answers? I'm not sure.
Thanks. I think you're in the middle. Yes, sir, you.
That's Andy. He was in state. He was a science advisor. Thank you. One of my guys.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you for beginning with such wonderful testimony about George H.W. Bush. I was going to ask a question about intelligence, but I think I'll shift it in light of that last question. And that would be, with a nuanced or less than nuanced foreign policy, which were your words, less than nuanced, I think, in some cases where the president has been a little more outspoken in the New York police chief type attitude. With foreign policy and intelligence gathering so delicate, I wonder if maybe we are opening a great void into which adversaries are rushing in constructive ways as well, by the absence of us at the Paris table and with a less effective delegation going into Poland for the discussions on climate, for example. And one thing that's most interesting is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which I think you've probably given some thought to. And I wonder if, does that perhaps represent an opportunity for a more open-minded and outreaching administration, if they could see that way forward, to join that institution and move in that constructive direction where the basic power center is with China. And without us at the table, we have no voice in what it really does.
Well, and it raises this whole broader issue about how to think about the future. What's the global order going to be going forward? I mean, I remember when the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank was formed. The previous administration, not this one, rejected the thing summarily and out of hand. I forget who the Secretary of Treasury was. He was Deputy Secretary of State at one point before that. Huh? No, it wasn't Zellick. It was Lew. It was Jack Lew.
Right.
And I've met the head of the Asian Development Bank. Well, I go to China once a year for sort of a dialogue, you know, unofficial dialogue with various old counterparts. And they took us to meet a luncheon in honor of the AIIB head. And, you know, he was trained on Wall Street, for goodness sake. I mean, the guy's, you know, he talks the talk, really. And a pretty capable guy. I think we finally changed our mind and had a little more benign attitude towards the AIIB and said we're willing to work with them jointly on some projects that might involve the World Bank or others. But it goes back to this exclusive approach. Here we create this order after World War II, and then we have so many shares of the IMF. And we did want a capital expansion, as you know, and for years we were advocating for that, and Congress was holding it up so that China was left with whatever it was, a scrimpy small percentage of shares, and so some of these other important economies. And I think that finally has been adjusted somewhat. And but I do think it forces us to think. I don't think we have the answers here and now. But we have to think about what are the institutions, global institutions, where we all really need to be consequential participants. And if it's going to be the IMF or it's going to be the AIIB, I mean, or the World Bank, shouldn't a country like China have some kind of proportionate participation, proportionate to its contribution to the global economy? And we haven't thought through enough, I think, the issue of inclusiveness as we might have. And I would hope that we could in the future. And I don't think, I see no problem with us joining the AIIB either. I mean, it ought to be a reciprocal matter. There's enough to do around the world. And And if some countries, and how can we, with 4% of the world's population, and that's all it is, and a declining share of global GDP, okay, it's gone down. I mean, it was 50% at the end of World War II, and it's now down below 20% somewhere, but it'll keep going down. It's not going to go up. We got to figure out how to work, and the problems we face are global in nature. They need other actors to play a constructive role. So, and if China is constructive on the climate change issue, so much the better. I have nothing against that. Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of Western countries have joined. Yeah, right. Yeah. We should say one thing, that after kind of menacing our allies during his campaign, right? You know, NATO's irrelevant and Japan and Korea should get nuclear weapons or should think about it. I think we're coming out in a more or less stable place. It may not have been pretty getting there, but I think the NATO alliance in Article 5, I guess it is 5, have been reaffirmed, and I think the president's got pretty good relationships with Japan and South Korea. So, you know, on that score, we're in reasonably good shape. And that's kind of bedrock foreign policy, right? I mean, you don't have a foreign policy if you don't have alliances, it seems to me.
So I think we have time for one more question. This woman here in the front.
Yes, hi there. Ambassador, I'm wondering of your thoughts on the Iranian deal and Trump's administration's concerns. He certainly has talked about that a great deal. And during his campaign, prior to his election, that was very much front and center. It does seem to be a bit of a bad deal, so to speak, using that New Yorker language. New Yorker tried to prove.
Maybe I was being unfair to New York police chiefs.
I think that little disruption is long overdue in this country. So
Yeah.
but a great deal of money was given to Iran, and it was, there's not a lot coming out. There are many, many experts, of course these are always a great concern, over 10 years down the line, their ability to produce nuclear weapons. They certainly have not pulled back on their daily threats of destruction to both the state of Israel and the United States. And tying along with that, Secretary Clinton at the time, who did push internationally, and President Obama, from what I understand, was not keen on invading Libya and overthrowing Gaddafi, who was a dictator, there's no question, but was pretty much quieted down after Reagan had threatened him following the Lockerbie investigations that you better kind of pull it on your response to terrorism. So I wonder over your thoughts on Libya, how it stands today, the tragedy of Benghazi, which still seems to be a big question, and what we should do about the Iranian.
Right, well, let me deal with the Iranian one first. I have no problem with the fact that he withdrew from the Iran agreement. And I think that's a fundamental division within the foreign policy community. I mean, I think there were a lot of strong advocates for it in the last administration, and they felt very strongly about it. And they also said they thought if we didn't do it, I can remember John Brennan and others being on television saying that it would be war. I certainly did not agree with that assessment. But I'm influenced somewhat by the fact that I was ambassador to Iraq. And I had people killed in Iraq, and they were killed by improvised explosive devices and things, and all of which technology had been, and training had been provided by the Quds Force, by the Iranian intelligence. We knew it in spades, absolutely. And so a lot of people, a lot of Americans got killed because of the role that Iran played in helping the extremist elements in Iraq. Now maybe I should, just suck that up, but I couldn't as a former ambassador to Iraq, and that's the way I felt. And also their behavior in other parts of the Middle East has been problematic, to say the least, whether it's in the Gaza Strip or in Lebanon or,
Latin America as well.
well, you can just stick to the region. It's egregious enough. But there may be some in Latin America. But you've got Syria, you've got Lebanon, you've got Iraq, and now the concerns that the Arab countries have. So, I mean, Iran is a problem. Here's the question. I think in terms of dealing with the nuclear issue in and of itself, that's not a bad agreement. I mean, it was pretty damn good, actually, in terms of the inspections it allowed for and the coverage and so forth. It didn't cover the missile issue as well, right? Because it allows for use of some, or development of those after a certain, I think, 8-year period or something like that. You're in charge of the implementation, so you're going to be able to correct me on that. Is that right? Was it 8 years?
So the UN Security Council resolution that accompanied the deal said that Iran could not test or deploy missiles designed to be capable of carrying a nuclear weapon, about which there was massive dispute about what that meant, but that was for 8 years from 2015.
That's right. So I think, if I could, because there's a lot in your question there. So for 8 years. So I think another troubling issue was that it had a time limit to it. And I think that bothered people. But the real issue is, could you negotiate a nuclear agreement and at the same time get agreements on all these other things? In other words, one is a relatively technical strategic arms issue and a non-proliferation issue, and the other has to do with regional peace. And I'm not saying you couldn't get some kind of deal on both, but I think that's what was bothering the critics of the agreement. And I think Mr. Trump's thought is to apply pressure on Iran so that it's willing to come to the table and talk about basically both sets of issues. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not, but I believe that's what the intent is. War hasn't broken out. Certainly these sanctions are causing a lot of complications and difficulties for the Iranian government and people. Whether that'll ultimately translate into some kind of a meaningful discussion, negotiation, I think we'll have to wait and see. On Libya, I don't know. I think the issue there was, did we really want to get involved in another Middle Eastern conflict? And Benghazi, I've been an ambassador to 4 countries and to the United Nations. I've been a consul general. That I don't know where you were at that time, but it was just a very exposed structure. They had no security. They were out in the middle of nowhere, and I'm not sure they could have been saved. Period. Mm-hmm. I really, it just was. It was just bad. They should never have had that facility there, ever. Mm-hmm. Practically every one of us who looked at the circumstances, and when we looked at it, we said, "Oh my God, you know, well, how could we have exposed ourselves in that way?" And we did.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. Do you feel that the invasion of Libya, and again, from what I understand, Hillary Clinton had applied a great deal of pressure on both the Obama administrations and our allies internationally to kick that into gear? Do you feel that was with good results? And
but we never invade.
Allowed in Iran, from what
are there what?
Are the inspections actually being allowed in Iran of the nuclear facilities? From what I understand, that hasn't been necessarily.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn. This is the last. You get to answer how it's being implemented.
The answer is yes. The inspections, in fact, were allowed, and the results of all of them were routinely shared with the United States, which led to the intelligence community to confirm that Iran was in compliance with the terms of the deal, which Secretary Pompeo agreed as well. So I think we're out of time, if our host here agrees. So Ambassador Negroponte, I just want to thank you so much for your insights and providing such a really such a human take on really big strategic challenges. And thank you for your service to our country, to our State Department, to the whole foreign policy apparatus of the United States over the years. It's an honor to sit on the same stage with you. And thank you very much for sharing all of your insights with us.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
You're good. Thank you a lot. Thank you. You have to mention this. Are you going to mention that?
I want to again thank both of our special guests and members of our community here. They really have elevated and extended the conversations that we get to have here every day. John met with a group of undergraduates this morning, and it was just as exhilarating and as fun as this session was. So I can't thank both Steve and John enough, our two ambassadors. And thank you all for coming, and please thank our staff who worked so hard to put these events together on the way out. They've had a busy week and will continue to have a busy week. On Friday at 3:30, we have one delightful final event this week, which is Sid Milkis and a colleague, Dan Titchener, from the University of Oregon, the Phil Knight professor at the University of Oregon, which there is as important as the Schlesinger chair is here, if you follow Oregon sports at all. Together, they have written a terrific book called Rivalry and Reform, which is about presidents and social movements. Sid is the Miller professor here at the Miller Center. You can imagine how important that is to us, and a professor in the politics department where he is really the leading scholar in the United States on the presidency, along with someone at Yale, Steve Skoranek, who I got to work with as a graduate student. And this is Sid's next big book, and it is a really important one. We hope you will join us Friday at 3:30 here. So with that, John and Steve, thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next one. Oh, and finally, as John reminded me, there are a few copies outside. This is a very short version of the excerpts from the George H.W. Bush oral history that we conducted with the Bush Library and Foundation. We've got a few copies out in the back, which you can have. And if we run out, just let us know, and we can probably find you one or two more. We really are very proud of these oral history projects. Not only do they preserve the memories of the senior administration officials, but they give us an important connection to the most important people who have run the federal government for the last 40 years. So thanks, John, for remembering that.